Hey everybody, welcome back. We're so happy to have you here at Gettysburg 159. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. I'm Garry Adelman. We got Kris White behind the camera. We got Sarah K. Bierle behind there as well. And we have a guest that I know you're gonna like. We'll see if he's on his on game. We'll have to see. I'll give you a hint. He's a colonel and he speaks almost as quickly as I do. So we'll bring him on shortly. But before we do, let me tell you where we are. Here we are between the lines at Gettysburg, okay? And some of you might recognize some of the hills, some of my favorite hills in the world, over my shoulder, and that is, of course, the Round Tops. What that means is that we're looking southeast, and as we come over a little bit this way, you're looking toward Cemetery Ridge, the Union position, or on the fishhook, you're looking or approaching the center or the center of the Union fishhook. You can see the Pennsylvania Memorial up in that direction there, and as we move over this way, you'd be looking toward the angle, toward the high water mark of the Confederacy, or so it's known. Here we're looking across the field of the attack of July 2nd and July 3rd. We'll talk about that as well. And now we're looking over toward the Confederate line, Seminary Ridge, the line that wrapped around the Union line. We're down here over there. So we're really, and as we go down there further, of course, we're looking toward the end of the Confederate line that's going to try to envelop and get around the Union line. I think most of you know what I'm talking about here. It wouldn't surprise me at all if Kris White has already put up a map as to where we are standing. Now, what we're talking about on July 2nd, and that's what the focus is here, is an attack by 2.5-ish Confederate divisions. You're pretty familiar with the first two. This is John Bell Hood attacking farther away, and he attacks the Round Tops, Devil's Den, and parts of the wheat field, okay? And then next to him is coming in Lafayette McLaws, and McLaws's guys are attacking places like the wheat field and the peach orchard and the Cadore Swale between here and Cemetery Ridge. But then there's that third division. You don't hear a lot about it. It's in a different corps. It's not Longstreet. It's A.P. Hill's division under Richard Anderson. Anderson will eventually continue to rise higher and higher. He's going to end up commanding a corps later. But here he's got a division of 5 brigades. Now there's a difference here, and this is something I don't think I've talked about before. When you look at Hood's division, it's composed of 4 brigades, but it's 1-1, 1-1. 2 in front, 2 in back. That's a solid reinforcement you got going there. You look at McLaws, 2 in front, 2 in back. The Georgians, for some reason, are always in the second line to mop things up there, okay? So you've got compact formations. That is, until you come over to Anderson, who's got a long line that he's occupying, and his guys are strung out. This is the result of the fact that the Union has more men on a shorter line and the Confederates have fewer men on a longer line. They're spread out, they're attenuated, and eventually you just can't have solid blocks. There's not enough Confederate divisions to do that. So when you look at Anderson, we're talking about 5 different brigades. And if I look over in this way, and Doug is going to get into that, oh my God, I've revealed our guest, is going to get into this more. But if I look over there, I can imagine some Alabamians under Wilcox advancing across this field. I could imagine some Floridians under the command of a guy named David Lang advancing across this field, okay? Not one behind the other, side by side. Next to them is going to be some Georgians attacking across just where Pickett's Virginians would go during the battle the next day, Wright's Georgians. Then there's sort of a break, and then there's some Mississippians under Posey that go part of that way. The one brigade that doesn't advance is Billy Mahone. So note that these Confederates under Anderson are really covering a broad front. They have no one behind the other to exploit any gains that they are making. And what's going to happen is Wilcox is going to run into the 1st Minnesota and portions of the 2nd Corps. And then here comes Lang his Floridians will run into portions of the 2nd Corps, portions of the 1st Corps as well. You've got Wright's Georgians running into everybody that the Union can scramble at that point. And you've got the same thing happening with Posey, who doesn't even get all the way across. So we're going to unpack this a little bit, and I'm going to bring on Doug Douds, Colonel Doug Douds. He's our good friend, U.S. Army War College, licensed battlefield guide, awesome person. And Doug, let me just say, I mean, how can you try to describe, or can you try to describe, the manner in which the Union is really scrambling as Anderson's guys come to undo the entire position?
Yeah, so first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. You know, if we read our Clausewitz right, he would say that defense is more than a simple shield, it's a series of well-directed blows. And what we have out here on the Emmitsburg Road on the Union side is a simple shield. It's a line along this high ground. Because even if we take a look at where the Union line is, when we think about that Sickles moves his men 3/4 of a mile in front of the rest of the Union line, let's face it, we're out here on high ground. You got to go down to get to the Union line, and you got to go down to get to the Confederate line. So it's a line out here on high ground. Some people call it the Emmitsburg Road Ridge. Most people are familiar. We talk about Graham's brigade over in the peach orchard. Then it would be Brewster's brigade, and then finally it would be Carr's brigade. Remember, Bierle will be the general reserve for the line out here, and his regiments will be piecemealed as they go. There would be skirmishers out in front of the line. You would have the 1st Massachusetts out here. You'd have the 5th New Jersey. You'd have 1st U.S. Sharpshooters out here. Those are from Hobart's Ward Brigade down in Devil's Den. And it's one of the great reasons to go stand out in the field in places like this. Look at this little bit of a micro terrain in front of us. You can see we have an intervisibility line. You could see why they would have to kick skirmishers out here. If you were sitting back at the Emmitsburg Road, you couldn't see over that ridge line, so what you do is you kick your skirmish line over there. That explains at least where the Union line is at the beginning of this attack. Now, as Garry set this up, we're going to pick up individual brigades as they start to come, starting with Cadmus Wilcox Alabama Brigade. Remember, Cadmus Wilcox's Alabama Brigade to start the July 2nd is the very southern end of the Union line. They're going to end up having men that are literally going to be facing south in order to make this happen, especially the 8th Alabama. When they are preparing to make this attack, Cadmus Wilcox will slide his line up so that it can be more aligned with the Florida Brigade. He has almost 1,700 Alabamans in his line, of which 4 of those regiments would be compacted together. We'll talk about the 8th because they kind of get lost in all this. Then you'd have, as Garry brought up, Colonel David Lang is the colonel of the 8th Florida. This is one of those command and control relationships we have to keep in mind while we're out here. You know, he's the colonel of a regiment before this. Edward Perry gets ill. That's how he becomes a brigade commander. So, you know, 2 weeks ago, he's a regimental commander. Now, all of a sudden, he's a brigade commander, and he's responsible for now 742 men. It's his first command as a brigade commander. Now, what he's going to do out of that, and it makes sense when you read his orders. What his orders are, hey, boys, once we see those men from Alabama go forward, we want to kick out a strong line of skirmishers. We're going to go with them, and we're going to keep every inch of ground that we hold. So that's certainly the idea, and then of course Rand's Wright's Brigade. Now, to put this all in context, we know what's going to happen. It's about 6 o'clock in the evening. Barksdale's Mississippi Brigade, 1,600 men on a 300-yard front, going to cover that 500 yards in just under 5 minutes, slam into the peach orchard, shatter that peach orchard salient, and now the Union line is starting to collapse out there. About that same time, Dan Sickles gets wounded, so now think about the confusion that's going to take place over in that line. And now you'd have Wilcox Alabamans exit the woods. Once they do, they come under fire because we're going to have multiple batteries out here. We're going to have Seeley's battery sitting over there by the Klingel barn. That's going to be the white building we see. We're going to have Turnbull's battery out here. Remember, one of the things that comes out to support the Union line is the artillery reserve, those 118 pieces of cannon that don't belong to any unit in the Army of the Potomac, but rather wherever the Army commander wants to go ahead and put his emphasis, he can put those batteries. Turnbull's battery belongs to them. So what both Wilcox and Lang will talk about is that immediately they are showered with shot and shell. The skirmishers out in front will contest this advance all the way. What they're going to do is the skirmishers will eventually fall back. 1st Massachusetts all the way down to the end of the Union line. 5th New Jersey is going to fall in right around the Klingel farm. So now you'd have these lines, picture now, long lines of Confederates advancing across this field. And you can see how wide open it is. Now, at the same time, because the peach orchard is collapsing, this is Andrew Humphrey's division. What he's going to have to do is kick some troops down there to deal with Barksdale. Because once Barksdale shatters this line, he's going to wheel towards us and almost start to attack up the Emmitsburg Road. For all these Union soldiers here, they're trying to fight Confederates coming at their front. And as they do, they're going to have Mississippians threatening their left flank, and that doesn't work. So what they're going to do is they're going to refuse the line just up here to the south. Where you see the Klingel barn is a good reference point for us. They will bend the line back. It'll go at about a 45-degree angle, almost down to the Trostle Lane, or just to the east of the peach orchard. This is to help contest Barksdale's brigade. On top of that, though, one of the things Humphreys is going to have to do is going to have to pull some of his regiments that are down here. All his only reserves, 120th New York. The 74th New York, who's his flank guard at this point, is now going to go rushing down there to try and keep his left from being in trouble. At the same time now, Wilcox Alabama Brigade will come through here, and we'd also have Lang's Floridians. This will be a brutal fight, but truth be told, if you read Humphrey's account, he says, I could have held. But it's ultimately his left that's collapsing. And because his left is collapsing, he can't stay here. With Sickles down, now we'll have General Birney is going to be the 3rd Corps commander. He's going to order Andrew Humphreys to abandon the field. Now, what he's going to say is he's going to give the order. Seeley's battery is going to start to pull back, caught in a crossfire between the Alabamians and the Mississippians. They're going to start to pull back for Turnbull's battery. In fact, many of his horses will be shot down. It'll be infantry that's going to have to help drag these pieces off. In spite of that, they're still going to leave 4 guns on the field. Meanwhile, the Union's starting to react, though, as Humphreys makes a rather disciplined fallback here. His men are going to fire, turn around, march back, turn around, and fire again. This is a relatively calm fallback. But what's going to happen is everything off to the south of us is a disaster. It's just rolling up the line. They cannot stay here, and now they're going to start to fall back across the field. The reaction to this is to bring other batteries out here. Julian Weir's battery is going to be just north of the Trossel Lane. It's going to be firing into the very northern flank of Lang's Alabamans. The 19th Maine is going to be out there supporting Wheel. In fact, when Weir says, I'm thinking about getting up and pulling back, when all of a sudden they showed up behind me. Now, this is not easy work for those units. Those units are going to start the day almost up by the copse of trees, out in that field, with all these men falling back. Many men, including people like Winfield Scott Hancock, are saying, hey, we need the 19th Maine, the 1st Minnesota. We need you to stay put, to act as a net to catch all these men from the 3rd Corps that are falling back, that we might reestablish, and it just doesn't work. Finally, those regimental commanders are going to offer for their men to lie down, that those retreating soldiers can retreat back over their backs. All this will continue to rush forward as they now fall back to the line. This simple shield out here along the Emmitsburg Road is shattered. Now what we're going to find is a series of reactions back on the line behind us. This is a series of well-directed blows.
Good. I just wanted to hop on. We're not going to mess with this mic anymore, so stay right near me, Doug. This is perhaps the strangest stance I'll adopt during this entire live here. A, you're with the American Battlefield Trust. We're between the lines with one mic here at Gettysburg for Gettysburg 159. B, a lot of people are impressed the way that Doug just kept on talking during the mic swap. Well done, sir. And C, we enjoy all your questions and all your kind words, and we hope you're having a meaningful commemoration. Let me interrupt to say that Doug is talking about a lot of stuff. You do not grasp this in one day or 1 week or 1 month, but you might want to read Harry Font's Gettysburg the Second Day for an excellent description of this. You can go beyond that by reading the official records of some of these units who fought here. That's very helpful. And you can also look into some of the soldiers like we're drilling down to during this anniversary. And remember, hit us with your best hashtags and your best comments, and Sarah K. Bierle will decide which 3 of you win free Ancestry memberships and which 10 of you get the Gettysburg Ancestry Fold 3 t-shirt, the rarest of the rare. So keep hitting us with your cool hashtags and whatnot. And I think with that, Doug, proceed.
Okay, so what we should think about, though, is this fight is short, sharp, and severe. For Humphreys' division that comes out here, almost 3,500 men in these 2 brigades, ultimately, he's going to suffer over 40% casualties. It shouldn't be lost on us that the Confederates are also going to suffer here. And it's a difficult thing when we study this battle, because for both Wilcox and Lang, they will fight on July 2nd and July 3rd. So when you see their casualty numbers, it's a little more difficult to understand what casualties were suffered on July 2nd and what would be suffered again on July 3rd when they would cross almost the exact same ground. But nonetheless, what they would talk about, Lang in particular would talk about death commenced its work early, and that he suffers throughout here. 2 brothers from the 5th Florida, the McClellan brothers, had joined. In fact, they had crossed the field. Well, the younger brother was 17 years old. Earlier this year, he expired because of disease. His older brother, Corporal Rudolph McClellan, during this attack would actually be mortally wounded as he crossed the Emmitsburg Road. In fact, he would die on July 5th. Imagine his parents later on in Florida learning all within the same spring and summer that the 2 sons had died out here. The other thing to keep in mind, and this becomes important for our later story when we talk about things like the 1st Minnesota, when we talk about band-aiding together the Union line back on Cemetery Ridge, when we look at Wilcox's brigade, they are almost perfectly split. The 9th and 10th Alabama to the south of the Spangler Lane, the 9th and 14th to the north of it. As they come across here, the 9th and 10th talks about, hey, we're incredibly disorganized about the time we get to the Klingel farm. In fact, even as they're driving the commands forward, Barksdale's brigade would say the same thing. We wanted to stop and reform, and Barksdale would keep on driving, know that they have this window of opportunity of driving the Union back across this field, that if they stop to let them catch their breath, they'll be able to form a defensive line. So when we think about Wilcox Alabama Brigade and Lang's Florida Brigade going going across this field, that they are disorganized from this fight. We cannot lose this, because ultimately we jump to the numbers and we say, here's what they had, when we start talking about that series of well-directed counterblows later in the evening, 1st Minnesota, Willard's Brigade, and even 19th. And finally, ultimately, for the guys that are going to stop part of Wright's Brigade, who, as Garry said, fights everybody, including a lot of Humphrey's men that have finally had some time to reform. What have I missed? What are the blanks?
Well, no, I mean, we could go on studying this forever. Thanks so much, Doug, because, you have to be pretty far along to have all this stuff make sense. I mean, both of us prepared a little bit for this, just to be ready to do this. This is one of the most confusing fights, and zooming way out, those 2.5 Confederate divisions number some 16,000 soldiers, maybe 17,000 soldiers, and they're going up against at least 45 to 50,000 Union soldiers. No matter where the Confederates attack, they are on average facing every brigade facing a division 2.5 to 3 times its size. But the Union was not well positioned to be able to deal with that, and that's why you have, I think, even General Meade entering this fight and leading some of the Vermonters in on the 2nd day. People know a lot about them on the 3rd day, but you've got 5 different Union Corps going up against these 2.5-ish Confederate divisions. So that's one of the reasons that really favored Meade. He's got the interior lines, plus he is able to shift them around. It didn't matter which command you were part of. Everybody is jumbled by that point.
It's a really good point about, we see 2 entirely different styles of command. Imagine George Gordon Meade is in his 5th day of command. He's used to being a Corps commander, used to being out on the field, directing units into battle. Whereas we know Robert E. Lee has this philosophy of, I put my men and my generals in position, and then it's up to them and the providence of God to deliver victory. Well, that's pretty hands-off. I mean, and what Longstreet will call the greatest 3 hours of fighting on any field of battle totally works. It pulls Union soldiers to the far end of the field, so that when Rand's Wright's Georgians go around the Cadore barn and now slam into where we see the Regulars Monument, or what looks like the Washington Monument, and they break through, they're going to wait for that next domino to come, to widen that opening and deepen the opening. But of course it doesn't come. They'll send runners back and it doesn't come. And ultimately, when they finally don't see anybody coming at all, they're going to fall back across this field. Now, you should ask yourself, why does this break down? For the last 3.5 hours, every brigade in the row has gone. But now, all of a sudden, Posey doesn't go, or goes halfway. Mahone doesn't go. And she goes, well, so this should be a division commander. This should be Anderson. Well, where's Anderson on July? Well, AP Hill is sick. Well, what about Robert E. Lee? Well, Robert E. Lee loathed to step on the toes of a new Corps commander like AP Hill. And even when we think about the chance that happens on a battlefield, Dorsey Pender is riding south to get this thing going again, where at random a U.S. shell will explode in the far end of the field and hit him in the leg, and he's out. And we shouldn't think this is a small thing. Later on, when Robert E. Lee is the president of Washington College, what we now know as Washington Lee, he will talk to his executive secretary, Colonel Allen, and he will tell him, had Dorsey Pender stayed in the saddle another 30 minutes at Gettysburg, we would have won. Kris?
This is a tough act to follow, let's just put it that way. But Doug brings up a couple things I like to talk about here.
Oh, please.
And one is leadership. I think that you bring up a great point about Cadmus Wilcox being out here, David Lang, others. And Cadmus Wilcox will write in his letters after the war, or after the battle, and say, where was Richard Anderson? Where was my division commander? And he'll state that I don't think he crossed this Emmitsburg Road. And he doesn't write that in a positive way. He writes it in a very angry tone. We also see with the leadership down here with the Confederates kind of breaking down at the beginning, where Lafayette McLaws is supposed to lead the march down to the end of this field, and then John Bell Hood is actually extended to go around the Federal left, and this is going to set off Lafayette McLaws. He's going to start pouting, on top of the fact that Longstreet was pouting, on top of the fact that John Bell Hood was saying we shouldn't even attack here. So we have all this starting to mix into it, and then of course there's AP Hill, who is Mr. MIA during this battle. I always joke, and you've probably heard me on this say this 1,000 times, when Lee rides up to the Cashtown Inn the day before on July 1st and he says, what's going on down the road? And Hill's basically like, I don't know. That's not the reaction that you want. So you're seeing a command breakdown on this side, I believe. Then on this side over here, on the Federal side, we have a passive defense, but then we also have an active defense at different times. This is a passive defense right out here along the Emmitsburg Road, but you have an active defense down in the wheat field, up on Little Round Top. even out in front of us at the Pennsylvania Memorial. And that's what they're taught at West Point. You should, if you go on the defensive, you should have an active defense. And what that means is when the enemy attacks you, you should be ready to counterattack. You should have a force ready. Robert E. Lee's great at this. Look at Chancellorsville, exactly what he's doing. Stonewall Jackson comes out on May 1st, sets up a defensive line and says, no, we're not sitting back, we're going after these guys. So what we're starting to see is the Federals learning a few things or two, and also they're all, for the most part, working well together. Even with Dan Sickles out here throwing a wrench out here, we have Winfield Scott Hancock, and I was talking about this with Sarah earlier, we're seeing leadership and management. We have leadership at this level with George Gordon Meade. He is setting up Winfield Scott Hancock, feeding him men, allowing Hancock to manage the battle. Now, I think Meade overreacts to a point where he sends most of the 12th Corps to this side of the field, but he is in a leadership role where he is setting up his junior subordinates for victory, and it's up to them to basically get that end product out here. So I think that's what we see a lot of out here, and I'll let Doug, who is the best leadership person I know, correct me on any level that he likes.
No, this is great. Actually, so, you know, you think about it, for every Army commander, there's three things you got to do. You got to learn from the past, you got to anticipate the future. Fact is, though, you're never going to get the future right, so the last thing you're going to have to do is adapt to reality. The idea that George Gordon Meade keeps a reserve from what's left of the 1st Corps sitting behind Cemetery Hill to when the 5th Corps arrives and now they're the ones who come out here to support this, or when the 6th Corps comes up. Meade is incredibly disciplined about always keeping a reserve that he might have something to adapt to, of course, the wily Robert E. Lee. And while, of course, they don't anticipate well, they adapt incredibly well. And if you think about this, all this is friction. And so one of the things, you know, if we read our Boyd, right, he talks about, you know, harmony, initiative, decrease friction. But taken to an extreme, too much harmony, now you become ossified or predictable. So what we always want to also include in there is rapidity and speed. So this doesn't have a lot of rapidity and speed, but a lot of harmony. This is the simple shield that get broken. After this, we add all kinds of variety and speed with counterattacks, and that provides the ultimate shock that stops this Confederate attack. And as you bring up, you know, Robert E. Lee would write after this, except for a proper harmony of action, we would have been successful. Massive understatement. And it could be the massive understatement for the whole battle, because I would argue this is a point, at least this part of the field, and we hardly ever stand out here, that this might be his best opportunity. This is his best punch thrown here at Gettysburg, and he's so close to achieving it, and yet it falls apart. Not so much because of the breakdown, but it's always a mix. Part of the breakdown of the Confederate practice, part of the very practical, harmonized teamwork, rapidity of response of the Union Army too, and it takes those, and of course it's always relative. You just got to be just enough better than your adversary.
And you always bring up out here, which I always like, you talk about, you know, if your tactical and your operational objectives out here are not working at the optimal, and it's not getting you to the strategic end that you want, you'll even take suboptimal results. And there are definitely suboptimal results happening on the Union line, but they get that optimal end, which is the strategic victory here and the operational victory in the end. You can say it better than I just did.
No, I think that's spot on. So we have some imperatives whenever we talk about these battlefields, and I know I've shared this before. But at the strategic level, think about trying to win the war. At the operational level, think about the Gettysburg campaign. From the time Robert E. Lee leaves Virginia on the 3rd of June till he crosses over the Potomac River on the 14th of July. And then we have the tactical level. That's every fight, whether it's out here for the Emmitsburg Road or Aldie or Middleburg or the McPherson's Woods or Little Round Top. And so within those imperatives, everything we do at the operational or tactical level had better get you to your strategic end. And if it doesn't, it's waste. Which means we'll attack suboptimal activities at the operational and tactical level that get you to your strategic end over optimal ones that do not. And of course, within that whole strategic one, we're also held with the value of the political object determines the magnitude and duration of sacrifice, and that bounds our strategy. And so all those together lead us to these ideas of, even though that is incredibly suboptimal, it keeps them on the field, to which now they will have been on the battlefield with Robert E. Lee after 2 days, and that is truly novel.
See, I told you Doug could say it much better than I ever could, and that's why I wanted to set him up for that. But it's true. What we see out here is that the Confederates, they're starting to have this breakdown, and I go back to the fact that the Army of Northern Virginia has been bleeding out since June 2nd, 1862, when Robert E. Lee takes over the Army of Northern Virginia. When he leaves, when he takes over this army and he initiates the 7 days battles, he has 92,500 men. 13 months later, whenever he crosses the Potomac River back into Virginia, he has lost 92,000 men over those 13 months. It's almost a 1-to-1 ratio. This army's bleeding out. And at one point, John Bell Hood is going to say something along the lines of that Robert E. Lee said, you know, if we had men, but what we needed were leaders, and we were running out of leaders over time, and that's what we're starting to see here at Gettysburg. Robert E. Lee's holding commissions in his pocket, testing people when they come here to Gettysburg. Did they earn that star yet? I don't know about it, and some of them will be cashiered and some of them will earn the stars, but I think that's what we're starting to see is this breakdown. And you can call it about Stonewall Jackson this and Stonewall Jackson that, but he's only one man. We're seeing that at an Army level, that this is starting to break down that machine. Those lieutenants, colonels, majors, as field grade officers, as junior officers, they're falling at a rapid clip at places like Chancellorsville, 2nd Manassas, and especially at Antietam. So I think that's something to take into consideration.
So let's double down on this, because it is this competitive clash of wills. It's a competitive learning cycle, competitive decision-making cycle. If you say that the Army of Northern Virginia is running out of leaders, we could make the case that one of the response of the Union Army is as they lose. We've shattered the caste system that is West Point graduates. Well, first of all, we don't have enough because the armies are too big. But now the Union Army is becoming an industrial meritocracy. If you have talent, we're going to promote you. And so whereas kind of the leadership bend of the curve is starting to go down in the Army of Northern Virginia, it's on a rapid rise on the Army of Potomac. And it's going to continue this way to the end of the war. The Union Army is going to be getting better and better. And what we see here is every point here at Gettysburg, when it gets to that tipping scale, 1 minute one way or the other. In the past, it seemed to go to the Army of Northern Virginia. Here at Gettysburg, it tends to go to the Union way because of the initiative taken at some low level, because of a decision made for somebody to get somebody headed in the right direction. This is a difference maker here. I go back to leadership is the margin of difference between success and failure. And what we're starting to see here is the scales tip, and it will continue to tip in that direction to the end of the war.
Yeah, I oversimplify it by saying, you know, the Confederates put their best and brightest normally at the top at the beginning of the war, and they're bleeding out at a rapid pace. The Federals didn't always put their best and brightest, and now with political generals being relieved of command, you know, bullets are not democratic. They'll hit anybody, and the fact that, you know, attrition's going to take over these armies, the cream is rising to the top where there's no cream left on the Confederate side. That's how I kind of put it, and I will actually take the camera back from Garry, because I think that we're going to have Sarah come on here and talk a little bit about who is actually living out here in this neighborhood in 1863, because even though we're out in a farm field, this is truly a neighborhood. Hope you folks enjoyed the zoom into my chest.
I think that was the highlight.
1 second, we're going to try to get this one hooked on to my shirt. Okay, I think we managed. Well, Kris talks about having a hard act to follow. I don't know if I like going last on this video, but thanks for tuning in. I have been standing behind the camera reading through your Facebook comments. I'll also be reading YouTube comments once this gets over there. There are so many coming in, so many great hashtags. It's going to be really hard to decide who's getting those t-shirts. So keep them coming. I will be going through and reading all the comments, including the ones that I may have missed while it's busy here on the live. So keep those coming in, and you're going to make it really hard for me to decide next week. Now, as Kris said, we want to talk for just a couple minutes about the battlefield that we're standing on here today as a community. And this is something that I like to do, standing out on the battlefields. I'll get to do some military history a little bit later in the afternoon, but let's just talk about civilians for a second. So all of this fighting, all of these soldiers have descended onto the Gettysburg community, which has about 2,400 people living here at the time of the battle. And one of my little jokes that I sometimes use when I'm trying to explain this concept is there are not any signs in southern Pennsylvania in the 1700s and the 1800s that say land reserved for a big battlefield. You know, today we have signs that say preserved because it's hallowed ground, but back then people are building communities. They never even think that a civil war could happen, and if it did, that those armies would come to their community. So what happens here in July of 1863 with thousands of soldiers in blue and gray descending on the community is very shocking to the civilians in the area. Now, one of the families, or one of the couples living right in this area where we're standing today are Peter and Susan Rogers. And they're an older couple, and with them they have a young woman named Josephine Miller who's helping out on the farm, helping with the housework, the cooking, those sorts of things. And we believe that Susan Rogers leaves. She refugees away from her home at the time of the battle, and a lot of civilians did this. They would leave, try to go somewhere else, maybe stay with friends, maybe relatives, maybe just go down the road trying to get away from the battles. But it's also believed that Peter Rogers stays, and we know that Josephine Miller stayed. And I think, from what I've seen on Kris's side, I think he's putting up some pictures of these folks, which I greatly appreciate. So hopefully you're getting to see some of their faces as we're talking about their stories here. Now, on the afternoon of July 2nd, 1863, Josephine Miller, who's 27 years old, she is in a house in the middle of converging battle lines. And what is she doing, at least in the early part of the day? She is baking bread. And it said that she baked an entire barrel of flour into bread during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now, some of the Union soldiers particularly remembered Miss Miller. They were men from the 1st Massachusetts, and they were coming into the house and getting this fresh baked bread. I'm a baker myself when I'm not doing history and, you know, running around battlefields. And let me tell you, if there's fresh bread around, I'm either looking for it, or if there's people in my house or apartment, they're coming for it as well. So imagine the smell of bread coming from the Roger house where Josephine Miller's doing this baking. It must have just attracted these soldiers. They're hungry. Some of them haven't had rations issued for a while, so she's here baking bread. And remember, this is by hand. She's not putting it in a bread machine. She's mixing it and kneading it and doing the entire long process throughout the day of July 2nd. Now, it's my understanding that Josephine does take refuge in the cellar as the fighting starts getting really close. She will survive the battle, and she has a role to play in the post-war history. And hopefully you're able to see a picture, because when the 1st Massachusetts veterans returned to Gettysburg...
Hold it up.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was getting some sort of signal from the cameraman and I wasn't sure what that meant.
Flip it around.
Okay, well let's show off what book we're using, because people might want it for their collection. This is Farms at Gettysburg, Fields of Battle. It's by Tim Smith. Absolutely add it to your collection if you are interested knowing about the farms in the area. It's a great overview, a great place to start. Now that I know what the signal is, we're going to turn it around here so you can see a picture of the 1st Massachusetts veterans, and they are here dedicating their monument. And you might notice that something really special happens. So there's a photographer named William Tipton who's taking these pictures, and the veterans had actually paid for Josephine to return to Gettysburg and be here at the battlefield with them for this special event. So she's here with the veterans, and the photographer, William Tipton, gets the bright idea to get a stove and take a picture of Josephine with some bread. She's holding a loaf of bread and she's standing by a stove to memorialize, to commemorate her role here at the battle. And this is just one example, one story of civilians here in Gettysburg at the time of the battle. There's hundreds of stories. Some are easier to believe are true than others. Check out our video on John Burns from yesterday, where we kind of talked about, oh, what's true, what's not. But as you're out walking the battlefields, or as you're watching the videos at home, remember that these fields that we have the privilege to be in today, not only are they hallowed ground, telling the stories of the soldiers and their sacrifices here during the battle, the land also holds the stories of the civilian families who are affected when war comes to their community. And just as we talk about veterans always affected by war, there are civilian populations that are impacted as well. So keep that in mind as you're exploring. One of my favorite questions to ask when I first go to a battlefield is, who owned this land in the 1860s? And is there a story beyond the military history that might be interesting to explore as well? I hope you'll stay tuned. We'll be going live more this afternoon, so we've got more programming coming up for you. Gary, Doug, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll tie it up. Thanks so much, Sarah. We will be going live later, and one of the things you'll see the continuation of our coverage from this morning when the Liberty Rifles, 260 of them, are going to, commemorate and replicate the charge of the 1st Minnesota, which included how many men? 262. So we're going to do our best to cover that, connectivity allowing, and if not, we'll post it later. So we hope to do that a little bit and look for another live or two this afternoon. In between there, we don't know where we're going yet, or we won't tell you which is it. We appreciate all your hashtags. There's been a huge bump up, including I don't have anything witty to say, but hashtag I don't have anything witty to say, but would love a shirt, as well as something about reserving the battlefield, as well as a bunch of other good ones, some of which are taking Doug and Chris's comments about leadership into hashtags. And finally, by all means, a few of you are disagreeing among each other and even disagreeing with Kris and Doug. Of course, that's what all this is about. Go ahead and express yourselves as long as it's appropriate and legal. Let's keep that in mind. I think that this is a time to call it quits here. Thanks so much, Sarah. Thanks so much to Kris, on both sides of the camera. Thanks so much for Colonel Doug Douds, man. You rock, and y'all rock for supporting battlefield preservation and education.